It's a great honor to be asked to deliver the Kapuscinski Development Lecture, and I want to thank the University of Warsaw, UNDP, and the EU Commission for supporting this event. I've been a frequent visitor to Poland. I was in Warsaw the last time a little bit over a year ago when I spoke on a panel with Alexei Navalny, and I know that there are many people in Poland that are firm supporters of democracy, not just in Poland, but around the world. And I want to congratulate you on this. So in my talk, I want to start with a little bit of intellectual history about the way that institutions have entered into thinking about development, what some of the current problems and issues are, and then I want to conclude by using the COVID pandemic to illustrate some points about the role of institutions, that institutions are important, they're critical in both development in general and in dealing with a health emergency, but unfortunately they're not enough, and there have to be other conditions that countries need to meet if they're actually going to be successful in these endeavors. Now, to start with the historical part, in development economics, there was a period when it was largely institution-free. Early growth theories like the Herod-Domar theory or endogenous growth theories really only looked to economic factors of production in order to explain economic growth. This began to change in the late 1980s. I think a key moment was the publication of Douglas North's book, Institutions, Institutional Change, and Economic Performance, in which he argued that institutions were critical to explaining the economic development of the world, of the West. According to him, institutions are simply rules. They're persistent rules of the game that permit individuals to cooperate. And without such social cooperation, development is not possible. His writing gave rise to a school of new institutional economics that had a huge impact in the practical policies implemented subsequently by development institutions like UNDP or the World Bank or other aid agencies around the world. Now, at that time, for North and for many economists in his tradition, when they spoke about institutions, they were actually focused fairly narrowly on a certain set of institutions having to do with property rights and contract enforcement. There's a good reason for this. Obviously, no one is going to invest if they have to worry about their property being taken by governments or by criminal organizations. And you're not going to trade beyond a narrow circle of friends and family if you don't have contract enforcement. So the emphasis at that time on property rights as the core institution was a good thing because property rights were weak in many developing countries. But there were limitations to this approach. The first is that it was really not clear that Western-style property rights were actually a necessary condition for development. When someone like Douglas North spoke about property rights, he was thinking about independent judicial systems, rule of law, the ability to enforce court decisions. But what we've seen is that there are countries that really lacked those institutions that nonetheless grew. And the foremost counterexample to this rule was really China, which to this day does not have anything remotely like Western-style property rights. Property in China can be taken by the government at any moment. We saw a recent example of this when the state intervened to stop the ant initial offering a few weeks ago. And so it appears that there are functional substitutes for a Western-style rule of law, and indeed in the West, in Europe itself, many countries began to grow in the 18th, 19th centuries, really before they had developed a full panoply of the legal institutions that we associate with that. Second problem with the emphasis on property rights was that the justice of property rights enforcement depends on the initial distribution of property. If property exists because of theft or violence or social prejudice, then strong property rights simply reinforce the existing rights holders. And in many respects, if you look at Asia, countries like South Korea, Taiwan, and Japan, their post-war economic growth was highly dependent on a prior land reform that redistributed property away from existing kind of oligarchic property holders to ordinary people, which democratized the holding of property, but it violated property rights understood in this strict form. And then finally, I think that there's a recognition that there are many institutions beyond property rights that were really critical for development. For example, if you don't have basic transparency, if you don't uncover acts of corruption or malfeasance or incapacity on the part of the state, then you're not going to be able to hold the state accountable. This means that you really need something like freedom of the press. Transparency is the word that's used in the development world to really refer to something like freedom of the press and independent media that can uncover corruption and other acts of injustice. And furthermore, if you don't have some form of democratic accountability, transparency by itself is not sufficient to actually fix things. If there's not a way that citizens can hold governments accountable for poor performance, then all the transparency in the world is not going to do any good. And then I think in my thinking, one of the most important sets of institutions actually has to do with the modern state and state capacity. If you don't have a state that is capable of enforcing rules, if it doesn't treat citizens equally as citizens rather than as friends and family of whoever happens to control the state, then you're not going to get modern economic development. And I think in this respect, there is an important change that took place in the late 1980s. It was marked really by the publication of the 1997 World Development Report by the World Bank, which was called The State in a Changing World, because up until that point, I think economists had been under the sway of what's called the Washington Consensus or neoliberalism, or basically a kind of belief in the power of markets and a disparagement of the role of the state, which in many ways I think was very destructive, because as that 1997 report indicated, if you don't have a state, you can't enforce property rights, you can't deliver services, you can't have basic security. And this, I think, opened the door to what has come to be called the good governance and anti-corruption agenda. Another important turning point was the late James Wolfenson's 1996 speech, in which he spoke about the cancer of corruption as an issue that desperately needed to be addressed by the development community. Prior to that, I think because of the Cold War, many instances of gross corruption, like Mobutu Sese Seko in Zaire, were swept under the rug because they were an ally of the United States. But the end of the Cold War allowed the international community to focus on the issue of corruption, which has emerged as really critical to the poor performance of many governments since then. And so that, I think, really shifted the development thinking away from the emphasis of the 1980s and 90s, which had been on minimizing the role of the state and of promoting markets, privatization, and the like, and shifted it rather to this emphasis on the quality of the state, on good governance and anti-corruption. And that is still the world we're living in, where I think many development institutions push for this broad governance agenda. So it's not simply property rights and contract enforcement but it's broader legal systems, it's state capacity, it's the building up of impersonal institutions, basic state building, and many initiatives to counter the kind of pervasive corruption that occurs in, unfortunately, too many developing and transitional countries. So it's almost 25 years since Wolfenson's famous Cancer of Corruption speech, and the question is, what results have we gotten from this focus on good governance and anti-corruption over that period? And I've written actually a chapter in the Oxford Handbook of Governance with Francesca Racconantini, who works at the World Bank, where we review the empirical literature that attempts to measure changes in corruption over time. And our basic conclusion is that if you look at that literature, it's actually pretty disappointing. It's actually hard to see clear indications that aggregate levels of corruption have decreased. We all know anecdotally that there are many specific agencies or parts of governments that have been cleaned up. So, for example, in Georgia, there was a big police reform in the early 2000s that was quite effective in getting rid of police corruption. What we don't know is whether aggregate corruption has really changed, because we do know that in many countries, corruption simply moved from one agency to another part of the government, or worse yet, it moved from low-level bureaucrats to higher-level ones, to politicians, to presidents and prime ministers, where our knowledge of what's really happening is obviously very limited by their control over information. And if you ask the question, why has that agenda been so hard to implement? I think it really has to do with politics and political power. The problem with something like corruption, for example, is not simply a matter of knowledge. It's not a question of simply knowing what a well-governed country should look like and what are the sets of rules that govern an impersonal bureaucracy. You know, how do you compensate bureaucrats? How do you promote them, and so forth? Because that kind of knowledge, I think, is pretty widespread. The challenge really is one of politics and of political power, because the elites that are corrupt, that deliver bad services, don't do this out of ignorance. It's not that they somehow don't know how Denmark is governed. They benefit, they personally benefit from corruption, and they don't want to give up that power. And unless you have the political leverage to get them out of power and to replace them by other political actors that have different norms and standards, you're not going to deal with something like entrenched corruption. And unfortunately, no development institution in the world really has the power to bring about this kind of political change. There is plenty of efforts to do this through structural adjustment, through conditional lending. All of these, I think, in the end proved insufficient to really change the behavior of deeply entrenched politicians and officials holding power in many countries. I think one of the most successful efforts to do this kind of conditionality was the European Union's accession process, where countries seeking to get into the European Union had to meet very tough governance criteria in order to qualify. Unfortunately, as we're seeing now, the European Union set very tough standards for countries coming into the EU. It did not set standards for their performance once they got in. And it's turned out that in places like Romania and Bulgaria, there are still extremely serious corruption problems. And the EU is really very limited in the kinds of sanctions that it can apply to fix those. Since we're speaking at the University of Warsaw, you in Poland and in Hungary are now in a big fight with the European Commission over the attempt to apply rule of law conditions to the emergency funds that the EU is providing as a result of the COVID epidemic. And here, I think you can see that there's a real institutional weakness at the heart of the European Union because the decision-making process in many cases relies on consensus, where a single EU member state can veto the actions of the whole, and as a result, it's extremely difficult to, develop the decision-making or the proper decision to actually try to impose some of these rules. So I think this points to the the role of institutions and their importance, but the fact that they are not sufficient by themselves to bring about good results. One final example, I spent a lot of time in Ukraine, or I have been spending a lot of time in Ukraine over the past few years, and I think it's a very good illustration of the absolute centrality of politics to the political and economic development of a country. Ukraine has actually made a lot of progress, certainly compared to Russia, in democratizing its institutions. They failed once during the Orange Revolution in 2004. They had another attempt during the Revolution of Dignity in 2013-14 that brought to power a new government. And as recently as last year, there was this amazing election that brought Volodymyr Zelensky to power as president of Ukraine with an unbelievable, over 70% of the vote, and then his party, Servant of the People, coming to power with a similar kind of majority in the Ukrainian parliament. And so this is a kind of political power that any reformist government would love to have, and it's something that has not been achieved in very, very many countries. And yet, more than a year after these developments, we are seeing all of the reforms that were undertaken, and there are quite a few of them. There are some very impressive reforms that had been attempted of the health sector, of the central bank, of some of the SOEs like Naftogaz that were put under much better governance conditions. And one by one, these have been reversed. They were reversed in the most recent instance by a very corrupt constitutional court that is trying to protect the power of certain oligarchs that are operating in the shadows. But this, I think, points to the fact that institutions are really not enough. Ukraine on paper has the right institutions. It has these check and balance institutions. It has a judiciary, but political power and money are able to manipulate those institutions in a way that have completely undermined the reform agenda and have returned corrupt officials to power in that country, despite the fact that an overwhelming majority of voters in Ukraine expressed their disgust with corruption and the need to move on from this oligarch dominated kind of economy. Now, I don't think that the story is over in Ukraine. I work a lot with younger reformers, and I know that there are a lot of people that are very unhappy with the current situation, but I think it's a good illustration of the simple importance of politics to institutions. If the politics are not right, you're not going to be able to get the kinds of reforms that are needed to reduce levels of corruption. So let me, in the last few minutes, turn to COVID and the COVID epidemic. The people who introduced me have referred to this already, and I think that we can use this pandemic to illustrate some of the points that I made. If you ask what has determined the level of performance in dealing with the pandemic across the world, I would say, first of all, it's not democracy. This has been asserted by a number of people looking at China, where they've succeeded in largely controlling the epidemic through very authoritarian measures. But you also see democracies that have done well, and in fact, in some cases have done better than China. I would point to Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Germany. There are many democracies that have actually, everybody is suffering now from a second or a third wave, but some countries have dealt with this much better. And so I don't think that democracy is the most important criteria. I think there's really three. The first is state capacity. And that's where we talk about institutions. If you don't have the health ministry, the public health services, the doctors, the public health workers, you're not going to obviously be able to deal with a health emergency of this scale. But in addition to that basic institutional capacity, you need a couple of other things. The second thing you really need is trust. If people don't trust their government, if they don't trust each other, then they're not going to cooperate with mandates for social distancing, for quarantines, for other difficult demands that public health authorities make in a crisis like this. And we've seen lots of examples of this working out, and I would point to my own country, the United States, as a good case of this, where we have a political culture that distrust the government, but we've also had a high degree of polarization in the US that has turned red states against blue states, that has made cooperation between them in Congress, but socially as well, nearly impossible. We're going to see this playing out now as the vaccine is introduced, because there are many people who simply do not trust the vaccines, despite the fact that this is really the only path out of the epidemic. They don't trust the government, and they don't trust other people, authorities, scientific experts, whose authority is in the past has been the basis for establishing good policies. The final factor, I think, is leadership. So you can have good state capacity, you can have a country with a relatively high level of social trust, but if you have bad leaders, you're still not going to do well. And I think we've seen in this case a number of striking examples of this, of leaders that did not take the pandemic seriously, that gave bad advice. In this group, I would put someone like Alexander Lukashenko in Belarus, who denied the existence of COVID, someone like Jair Bolsonaro, the populist president of Brazil, Manuel Lopez Obrador in Mexico, and then finally our outgoing president, Donald Trump. All of these people saw the pandemic not as a threat to public health and to the general welfare. They saw the pandemic as a threat to themselves and to their own political positions. And their decisions were taken with regard to what they saw as their short-term political self-interest rather than to any kind of public good. And as a result, these countries have had very poor performance. Now, I will fully admit that there's many factors that lead to the way that you deal with a pandemic. And I think that what we're seeing as time has gone on is the state capacity factor has come back in a big way in many countries, because in Eastern Europe, in many parts of the developing world, the pandemic actually didn't hit that hard in the early days, back in April or May, when Italy and the United States were doing very poorly. But I think that, that's come to the fore as important as the quarantines and the lockdown have gone on, where it's been very hard to maintain a quarantine. It's been very hard to enforce different kinds of social distancing orders and the like. And so the relative importance of these has shifted over time. But the overall point that I want to make is that we were right, I think, to emphasize the importance of strong institutions. It's important to have rules. It's important to have state capacity. You need to have an impersonal, expert-led set of bureaucratic institutions to deliver the basic services that citizens expect from the government. But if those other factors of social trust and leadership aren't there, uh, that's not going to be enough. And I will say that the United States is the leading illustration of this point. The United States went into the crisis with probably the strongest set of health institutions of any developed country. We have many problems with our healthcare system, beginning with the fact that it's not universal. This is something that Obama tried to fix and succeeded only partially. But we have uh, a Food and Drug Administration, we have a Centers for Disease Control that at one time were among the best in the world, but they have become politicized and they have been overridden because of this lack of trust, where an act like wearing a mask has become a political statement. If you're a supporter of President Trump, you don't wear a mask, regardless of whether this makes sense from the standpoint of your individual self-interest. And so under those conditions, unfortunately, you get very poor performance, and this is something that I think is going to have geopolitical consequences down the road, because the countries that have done best are really all clustered in East Asia. It's not just China, but it's also Korea, Japan, Taiwan, and so forth. And in the broader geopolitical sense, they're going to be able to recover their economic growth and move ahead much more rapidly than either North America or Europe. And so we're going to be living with the consequences. Then, obviously, as was pointed out earlier, for the developing world, this has been largely a disaster because it's given an excuse to executive authorities in very many countries to expand that authority. This started with Orban in Hungary, but it's going on in Tanzania, Uganda, India. I don't think that China would have extended its security law to Hong Kong as it did earlier this year, but for the COVID epidemic, which gave it cover. Everybody was distracted by their own health problems, and so they couldn't push back against this Chinese decision. So we're living in a very difficult time for global democracy. I would conclude with a slight note of optimism that uh, a big crisis like COVID is also an opportunity, because I think that it exposes bad government in a very clear way. And an example of that is what's gone on in the United States, where I think the current president's poor performance in this crisis has really led to his failure to be elected for a second term. That's not the only factor, but I think it's a very important background condition. And there are other effective democratic leaders that have actually seen their popularity rise during the epidemic, like Angela Merkel in Germany or Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand. And so it's not the case that this is uniformly bad for democracy. It has revealed inequality in a way that is really quite striking. And I think that should provide the political basis for countries actually reforming their systems once the immediate epidemic subsides, to do the larger reforms that are needed to make their institutions effective. So with that, thank you very much, and I look forward to questions from the audience.
No matter how much I would like to talk about more economic aspects, majority of our guests so far have decided to ask you about several elements regarding democracy and its crisis. We have numerous questions. A colleague from our faculty, Alexandra Jarczewska, who's asking about the future of liberal democracy in the contemporary world, especially considering current political changes and trends. Then we have several questions related to the future of democracy with regards to Central Europe, especially Hungary and Poland, and also rise of populism and what could be done against it. Piotr Pietrzak from Sofia University asks whether Central Europe, like Poland, Hungary, but also Bulgaria, can learn something from the recent American experience when there is a new president and well, after a couple of years of a bit different governance. Then we have also a question from the representatives of the European Commission about reinstalling trust in democracy, institution, and politicians, and what can we do about it? So, Professor, broad questions, multiple, the floor is yours again.
Okay, thank you very much. So on the state of democracy globally, we've been in this period of democratic decline ever since the mid 2000s. So it's gone on now for about 15 years that the average democracy levels around the world have gone into reverse. There's two separate important drivers of this. The first is really the rise of Russia and China. So you've got these big countries that are authoritarian and they're trying to project their power around the world. And they've been able to do that fairly effectively. The Russians have used social media. They caught on very early that the internet was a tool that they could use to undermine the faith of democratic citizens in their own governments. And so they've been seeking to do that. China has had a different strategy. It has more resources. And so the Belt and Road Initiative has been really their major foreign policy vehicle. And, under the 16+1 process, it's extended all the way into Eastern Europe. And so you actually now have this situation where it's very hard for the European Union to criticize China over the Uyghurs or over Tibet or over any other issue because there will be some member state that is getting a big infrastructure loan from China and doesn't want to upset that relationship. So that's one set of challenges. The one that I think is more insidious is the rise of populism, where you've seen the election of populist politicians. So obviously in Eastern Europe, it's your country, Poland, and Hungary that led this movement, but virtually every other European country has a populist party like the AfD in Germany that is pushing to overturn the existing elites based on a highly nationalistic and illiberal political agenda. And the question about what you do about it is a really complicated one. I think that if you are living in a democratic country with, still more or less functioning democratic institutions, fundamentally the way you deal with this threat is you organize and you fight elections and you win elections. And I think that, the success of this we've seen in a number of places where actually opposition politicians have managed to be elected in cities or particular regions, and in some cases, have been able to win a degree of national power. So there was a question about what the American experience shows, and I think it illustrates exactly that. In the United States, over the past year, there's been an unbelievable mobilization of civil society basically to win the 2020 election. And this included, for example, a lot of my colleagues have participated in various efforts we understood that trying to delegitimize mail-in voting and other things would be a big issue that Trump would try to exploit. And so there's a big effort, for example, to help voting officials be able to actually stage a really good, clean election. And that, by and large, worked because most of them report that this was actually one of the fairest elections that's ever taken place in the United States. But the bigger issue was mobilization. That Donald Trump, had more than 70 million people vote for him, but he also has a lot of people that really don't like him. And he was very good himself at mobilizing those people to come out and vote. And so you get, I think, pretty close to 80 million Americans that voted for Joe Biden. And this led to turnout numbers that were unprecedented. We've never had, this large a percentage of the American electorate voting. Certainly in absolute numbers, it set quite a number of records. And that, I think, is ultimately the way you deal with that. Now, of course, the anti-democratic politicians will do anything they can to prevent free and fair elections from happening through gerrymandering, through disqualifying voters. And right now we're seeing this extraordinary attempt by a sitting American president to basically steal an election. He's trying to steal it in broad daylight by claiming that Biden won by massive fraud when there's absolutely no evidence that this happened. He's not going to get away with it. But I do think that it, illustrates this point that there's really, we used to have a concept in political science about a consolidated democracy where we said that if you had 2 or 3 changes between different political parties, you were safe and you were a consolidated democracy and you would not go backwards. And I think the experience of the US in the last 4 years shows that that concept is wrong. There's no such thing as consolidated democracy, that even the best, most institutionalized democratic system can go backwards and see its institutions undermined. And really the only protection against that is politics. People have to mobilize, they have to have good leaders, they have to have clear goals. And if that happens, then you can get political resistance to this attempt to undermine institutions. So that, I think, is a general rule. Obviously, in a place like Russia, it's not going to work because you don't have the possibility for real mobilization. Putin does not, permit any kind of real opposition to emerge, and so it's not a universally useful rule, but I think it's one that applies still in many parts of Europe.
There are also some questions related to the future of transatlantic relations, both in face of the COVID pandemic, but especially after the presidential election in US. It was one of professors from Warsaw School of Economics, Małgorzata Zajaczkowski, asks a question about the future of transatlantic relations.
Well, I think that Joe Biden is going to move very rapidly to try to reestablish the relations with NATO, with the European Union, with all of the existing institutions that have governed, our liberal international order as soon as he can. And because American presidents have a lot of discretion over foreign policy, that's something that he can do. He'll re-enter the World Health Organization. He'll re-enter the Paris Climate Accords and so forth. So that, I think, is all going to happen pretty rapidly. But I don't think that the relationship is ever going to go back to what it was before 2016 for a number of reasons. The first is that I think all Europeans and all American allies can see that the United States remains a highly polarized and divided country, where even if Biden was elected president, you still have maybe a third of the country that believes that he won through fraud, that he's an illegitimate president, that do not support an internationalist policy. And so I think that all Europeans are going to have to be a little bit cautious in assuming that the United States has simply returned to the pattern that existed for several decades prior to the Trump administration. The Republicans could make a comeback in the midterm elections in 2022. They could regain the presidency in 2024. And then, you'd be back into this kind of turbulence. The other thing is that, the one thing that Trump has done that I think is actually useful is by making the kinds of threats he did to cut off American support for NATO, to withdraw troops, it has given greater stimulus to European efforts to create, their own capacities, especially military capacities. Unfortunately, Germany should be the largest contributor to this, and they've probably done the least. The French have taken a little bit more active role in trying to develop this kind of independent capacity. I think that this is a good idea. I don't think it undermines NATO. I think it's something that can exist in parallel with a revived NATO. But I do think that the issue of burden sharing between Europe and the United States didn't start with Donald Trump. I mean, every American president for the last two generations has complained about Europeans not doing enough to help themselves. And I think that this is, something that is it's a reasonable demand, and I think that's something that will continue to be pressed.
I wanted to ask, but in this version comes from Damian Szacawa from Maria Curie Skłodowska University, who's asking about the, given again current situation, how do you see the future of economic and security multilateralism? So what is ahead of us for multilateral cooperation?
Well, there's a theory out there in international political economy that in order to get broad multilateral cooperation, you actually need a hegemonic power. And I think that was probably best illustrated by the existing institutions like the GATT and then the World Trade Organization, like, like the Bretton Woods institutions and so forth, because they all really depended on American power. If you didn't have one member that was willing to make sacrifices in order to build these institutions, it would be very difficult to get a sufficient level of cooperation from more or less equally powerful countries that could actually make decisions independently. And in a way, the European Union is an example of this. The European Union is a remarkable effort at multilateral cooperation in the economic sphere. It's really created, a very powerful set of institutions in Brussels to govern trade, investment, antitrust, all sorts of things. But it's not powerful in certain other areas, particularly fiscal policy and foreign and defense policy. And part of the reason is that there was no hegemonic power that basically pushed everybody into, creating such a set of rules. It normally would have been Germany as the dominant economic power in Europe, but for historical reasons, the Germans have never been willing to play this role. And so everything has had to proceed on the basis of broad consensus. And as I said, that's been really crippling in foreign policy because it's very difficult for the EU to actually take difficult decisions because of its decision-making power. And so you're kind of trapped in this equilibrium where because you're decision-making mechanism is weak, you can't strengthen the decision-making mechanism, and so it kind of reinforces itself. Now, this is all a prelude to saying that a lot of our existing institutions are there because of the United States. If the United States comes back, it will continue, I think, to support these legacy institutions. But I really doubt that the United States is going to be an innovator in this area the way it was in the past. You know, the most recent innovation was the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, that had been negotiated under the Obama administration. And it was, the US withdrew from the TPP on day one of the Trump administration. Now, I think that was a big mistake. I think the TPP would have been a very useful organization to have, but I really doubt that anyone is going to try to revive an American initiative to do more multilateral trade deals across the world, because even within the Democratic Party, the consensus behind this really doesn't exist. And so it's going to be up to other players in the international system. So one interesting development that I think is worth paying attention to is, you know, once the United States withdrew from the TPP, a number of countries in East Asia then decided, okay, we will go on without the U.S. And so they've formed you know, a regional economic, I forget the acronym, but they've formed a regional economic partnership to facilitate on a multilateral basis trade and investment in East Asia. Unlike the TPP, it doesn't include the United States, but it does include China. And so if the TPP had been an institution designed to contain China in a certain sense, the United States really failed. And now we're standing on the outside of a, you know, of a regional bloc. And so, you know, I think it's possible that there will be some degree of multilateral cooperation, not dependent on the United States, but it's going to be much harder because, you know, it's very hard to get consensus among, you know, these kinds of disparate countries.
Thank you, Professor. Let's change the topic and move towards East Asia. We have a question coming from Japan from Mrs. Huang Bian, who's asking about the development model of East Asian tigers. And her question is whether today in 21st century, the developmental state model is still valid, or maybe this mode of state-led development is already outdated?
Yeah, that's actually a very interesting question. I think that in many respects, the developmental state and industrial policy have had a second life in recent years. Again, just to repeat some of the history that I'm sure people are familiar with, you know, the World Bank published, I believe it was in 92 or 93, a World Development Report called the East Asian Miracle. And at that time, the World Bank was controlled by a lot of free market economists, and they argued that East Asia had achieved the growth record it had because it adhered to free market principles. And actually, it was Japan that was paying for that WDR, and they said, wait, there's something wrong with this, because that's actually not what we did. We actually intervened, you know, through industrial policy, through directed credits, as did Korea and a number of other countries in the region. And so, you know, the authors of that report had to go back and revise, but they basically didn't change their view that industrial policy was a very bad thing. You know, it was not good for states to override markets. And then the East Asian financial crisis happened, and it hit those countries that had liberalized their financial systems the most dramatically. And I think it really made people realize that you actually do need state regulation. You certainly need pretty strict regulation of the financial sector if you're going to avoid the kind of currency crisis that, you know, really began to happen all over the world after the liberalization financial market liberalizations that started in the late 1980s. The period from the end of World War II with the foundation of the Bretton Woods system up until the late 1980s was remarkably stable with regard to financial crisis, and it's become extremely unstable since then. So, there's a necessary rethinking, I think, of some of these beliefs about the power of markets to self-regulate. And I think that today, there's actually a kind of renewed interest in things like industrial policy because many Asian countries continue to use industrial policy fairly effectively. China doesn't do the same kind of industrial policy that Japan and South Korea did. They focus more on infrastructure and not so much targeting specific sectors, but they still have pushed, with state subsidies, um, a lot of their own economy, and they've been fairly successful. I think right now there's a realization that the governance dimensions are really critical, and that the one thing that many East Asian countries had that other developing countries did not have is actually a modern state high capacity bureaucracy that could oversee something like an industrial policy and guarantee that if development money was going to be used to support certain sectors and not others, that this was done based on an economic rationale and not for political reasons. I think ultimately the biggest argument against industrial policy was always not an economic argument. It was more a political argument that the process of distributing state funds would be corrupted by politics, and the money would start going to favored cronies of the ruling party. And we've certainly seen instances of that in Hungary, for example, where frankly the EU money has been, I think, grossly misused by Orban and the people around him. But that doesn't mean that, if you have a high quality government led by technocrats that are really focused on development, that industrial policy can't be used effectively. Just to round out this conversation, I would point out that although Americans claim they don't like industrial policy, we've had industrial policy for decades. Our major industrial policy agency is called the Department of Defense. If you look at the history of semiconductors, of radar, of aeronautics, and ultimately of the internet, these all started out as government investments through the Department of Defense. They were done for security reasons and then were later commercialized. And I don't need to, remind you of the importance of these technological breakthroughs, and they simply would not have happened. And it'll be an interesting thing to watch in the health sector. Governments have been pouring huge amounts of money into vaccine development, and it will be interesting to see whether there are lasting impacts on that sector, having gotten this kind of boost from the COVID epidemic that will then have longer term, positive consequences for the future ability to develop vaccines. So this is all a long way of saying I don't think that the developmental state is outmoded. In fact, I think that people are looking at it with greater interest right now, but they need to be careful because that kind of state power can easily be misused. And if you don't have the right politics and institutions, the strong institutions, then I think it is going to end up as as being very counterproductive.
Several of our colleagues, guests ask about the impact of cultural diversity on political and economic development. One of them is Aleksandra Jaskulska. Then we have a question from Monika Fonegra and Andrzej Polus about the different impacts of inequality on the current situation and development. Could you develop this a little bit?
So obviously, something like ethnic and racial diversity makes democracy more difficult. You know, if everybody looks the same and you know, has a very similar kind of cultural background, it's easier to get political consensus. But you should remember that the reason that we have liberal democracy is precisely to be able to govern over diversity. Liberalism was established in the 17th century after the European Wars of Religion. At that point, the diversity in Europe was not ethnic or national, it was religious. It was Protestants fighting Catholics that led to, you know, the death of maybe a third of the population of Central Europe in the course of the 30 Years' War. And, you know, liberal ideology evolved out of the belief that if you have this kind of diversity, you have to have rules that reduce the objectives of politics to basically simple stability and peace, and not have governments impose a certain set of religious doctrines on their followers. You had a similar upsurge of nationalism in Europe in the 19th and early 20th centuries that led to a similar kind of disaster. And the reason you had liberal institutions after 1945 was this recognition that in a Europe that was diverse in terms of language, nationality, ethnicity, you needed liberal institutions, you know, to govern them. So it is definitely possible to govern over diversity. One observation I would make is that human beings do not need factors like race and ethnicity in order to hate each other. And I think your country, Poland, is a good example of that, right? So Poland is extremely homogeneous ethnically and religiously. It's one of the most homogeneous countries in Europe, and yet you are very polarized. And you know, a lot of Poles hate each other. I think the divisions are not over ethnicity; they're over, you know, the division between people that live in big cities, you know, like Warsaw, and you know, people that live out in the countryside that have more conservative social values and so forth. And so I think you can get, um, you know, very strong divisions, social divisions, and polarization, you know, without diversity. And conversely, you can govern diverse societies effectively. But you know, without any question, in the United States today, unfortunately, race has come back as a big issue because we still don't live up to our ideals of racial justice, and you know, that has provoked a lot of people to, you know, feel that the system is really stacked against them. There's also white nationalism that's arisen in response to the demands from African Americans for racial justice, and that's part of the thing that's contributing to our current polarization. So, like I said, there's no question that it's hard to govern over that kind of ethnic diversity, but you can still get in trouble even if you don't have it.
Thank you, Professor. And well, University of Warsaw is the biggest university in Poland, but the oldest is Jagiellonian University from Krakow in Krakow. And we have a question for you from Marcin Grabowski, who's asking quite a tricky question about transhumanism and your opinion on this apparently dangerous idea.
Yeah, I wrote a book back in 2001 called Our Post-Human Future, where I argued that we need to be extremely careful about biomedical technologies, especially ones that can alter human genetics, because it opened up a way for some human beings to control the behavior of other human beings. You know, we've had governments trying to do this throughout the 20th century. Communism tried to create a new Soviet man that would be a different kind of creature, but in that they failed completely because they couldn't get human beings to abandon their ties, you know, to their families, to religious belief, you know, to all sorts of things. Um, but the question, you know, for the future is whether uh, biomedical technology will give us other alternative ways of doing this. Some of it could come through drugs. And so we have a lot of drugs now that control people's moods, that are meant to deal with depression, with anger, with all sorts of, I think, normal human emotions. And then we have these new genetic technologies that can alter the germline and, make changes in the way that human beings are that will then be passed down to subsequent generations. And I think we don't have an adequate set of social controls over the use of those technologies that would make sure that they are introduced in ways that do not produce, major, let's say, inequalities, where, for example, rich people could enhance the intelligence of their children and, make their families a kind of self-perpetuating elite, which I think would be a very bad outcome for democracy. Right now, I think people are more focused on the internet and on digital technologies as a threat to democracy, but I continue to believe that down the road, these biomedical technologies will be just as consequential.
We have a question about the impact of doctrines and religion on the perception of democracy in different parts of the world. So in other words, what affects the perception of democracy? What are the core factors?
Well, I think that it's pretty clear that actually performance matters a great deal. You can affirm a certain set of principles that you think are necessary for legitimate government, and you can feel that it's bad when a government violates it or a government based on different principles is established. But in the end, what people want out of government are some pretty straightforward outcomes. They want stability, they want peace, they want security, they want basic services like health and education, they want economic growth. And, this leads to what's called performance legitimacy, where a government that may not be legitimate in some deep ideological sense is nonetheless regarded as legitimate because of its good performance. And, this is something that's said about China very frequently, that um, many people in China no longer believe in Marxism-Leninism. They have a market economy. They're not operating according to communist principles very strictly in the economic sphere. And yet their government seems to be largely trusted because it's been very good at delivering some basic things like security, like stability, and especially economic growth. And I'm afraid that the COVID pandemic is going to affect the relative position of belief in authoritarian government versus democracy, not because democracies have done worse. As I said, I don't think there's a good correlation between democracy and performance in the epidemic, but people are really focused on the US-China comparison. And because China has been so much more effective in controlling the virus than the United States, I think it's going to get a lot of credit for that. And its form of authoritarian government is going to, um, you know, have more prestige. But I guess the final thing to say is that, that kind of performance is one of several factors that make up what has been called soft power, right? Soft power is the attractiveness of a particular system to other people. It can be based on performance, but other times it's based on other things. And, right now, I don't think the Chinese exercise much soft power in the sense of people loving Chinese culture, thinking that Chinese, behavior and society is really cool, that they want to emulate China. What they want is Chinese growth. Um, they want Chinese investment, but they don't want to behave like Chinese people. Um, they're not consuming Chinese books and movies and that sort of thing. Maybe that'll happen. Maybe that'll happen in the future. But right now, I do think that there are other components of soft power that determine your final influence in the world. And I think the struggle for influence with China is really still not over.
Thank you, Professor. And maybe let's move for a minute to a question from Indian colleague, Dr. Biswajit Mohapatra, who asks about your opinion about the relationship between high capacity bureaucracy and capitalist state. Is it like the high capacity bureaucracy kind of kind of conditionality to successful implementation of public programs?
Well, I think that a high capacity state is good for everything that a government may want to do. There isn't a single activity where more capacity is not is better than, whereas high capacity is worse than low capacity. So you want capacity. You know, the real issues have to do with the political control of that capacity. Ideally, you know, you want democratic, a legitimate democratic choice to be made as to what policies a government follows, and that uh, administration or you know regime then delegates to a bureaucracy the instructions to implement those policies. And that's where capacity really matters. So if the government picks the right policy, the bureaucracy should then, you know, administer it as effectively as possible. And it doesn't matter whether it's industrial policy or health policy or public security or what. That implementation is important. I think that there's some countries where the implementation part is the weak chain. You know, the governments are trying to do the right thing, but they simply don't have the state capacity to deal with, let's say, people that are put out of work and that are sick from COVID. They just don't have the people to, you know, to help or the resources. But in other cases, it's really that interface between the political layer and the bureaucratic layer that's the big problem, where politicians try to interfere with the implementation in ways that suit their own short-term interests but are not in public interest. And again, you know, we're seeing this with the vaccine rollout, where a number of political leaders like Putin are so interested in getting credit for having the first vaccine that they're willing to override their own health authorities and, you know, pushing for a certain outcome. So I think that that's you know really uh, the critical. Well, I mean, both of those are important. So it's both having the capacity and it's also having the right interface between that capacity and the politicians that ultimately make the decisions on policy.
Several our guests asked about the role of social capital. We have one question from Professor Donaj from Adam Mickiewicz University in Poland about the role of social capital in our region, meaning Central and Eastern Europe. Is there any space for it still, or again, maybe it's not that relevant anymore?
Well, I think capital is still a very important concept. I think that if people don't trust each other and are not able to work with one another on an informal basis, then you're not going to get collective activities of all sorts that are necessary to keep a society going. And in this respect, I think communism was particularly devastating because the essence of a totalitarian Marxist-Leninist system was in a way to destroy social capital. You know, the Communist Party said that we are the only source of authority in the society. We're more important than the family, than the neighborhood, than the church, than the labor union, than the, you know, any other type of human association. And they did everything they could to undermine those alternative sources of social connection. If you remember this little monster Pavel Morozov that used to be celebrated in Moscow, who reported his family to the NKVD during the 1930s. He was a hero in Stalinist Russia because he put the party above his own family. And that legacy, I think, is one that continues to haunt the region. I think that it's hard for people to cooperate spontaneously with one another in many post-communist societies. I think the situation in Poland is probably a lot better than, let's say, in many parts of the Balkans or Romania, where I sort of think that, in terms of these cross-country surveys, that always turns out to be one of the lowest trust societies anywhere in the world because of the Ceausescu regime. Uh, but it's still a big problem in terms of the spontaneous ability of people to start businesses, to enter into civil society, to organize politically, and the like. But there have obviously been big changes that have occurred there after the fall of communism, once people had the legal right to organize. And I think, those habits are really beginning to come back.
Thank you, Professor. So let's move to the final question, as our students are asking you for advice. Agatha Reed, one of our faculty students, asks if you could give advice to the students of the University of Warsaw who are going to shape the future of international affairs, what the advice would be.
Well, I think that, if you're really going to shape international affairs, you have to have an education that gives you two very different things. And I'm sure that the University of Warsaw does this. On the one hand, the reason you want a university education is to provide you with broad concepts that allow you to structure the way that you see the world. Uh, Now, some of these are provided by different academic disciplines. So if you learn microeconomics, you learn a number of really critical concepts for understanding how an economy works. But others are more philosophical. You need to understand basic democratic theory, for example. Why are checks and balances important in a political institution? What are alternative ways of organizing a political system and the like? And that's something that you usually need to go to a university in order to get. The other, however, has to do with practical skills that are necessary in the job market and that will be important, for you to actually move from the broad ideas to actual policies. As you can see behind me, I've been running a master's program at Stanford in international policy, and one of the things we've been focusing on is actually giving students a sequence in which they learn essentially policy implementation and how to move from, how to define a problem, how to come up with a solution, and how to develop an implementation strategy. And I think that as part of a professional education is really important, because if you go into a profession, you're going to be a practitioner and you're going to need to know how to deal with real world situations. So as a student, I think it's important to make sure that you get, you get both of these. You get the broad foundations in concepts, and you develop those, necessary practical skills.